Welcome all. Thanks for joining us. Uh, Brad Perry, I'm Chief Executive Officer at Grain Producers SA, and we're bringing you a webinar today from GPSA on Paraquat and Diquat and the APVMA update. So we'll kick right into it, get straight into it, and just want to remind you that as we go through the presentations, any questions, please put in the Q&A box at the bottom. Make sure that we do that and ensure that any questions at the end get asked. So we've got a cast of GPSA, Grain Producers Australia, GrainGrowers, GRDC presenters today. And we'll have a bit of time, as I mentioned, for a Q&A at the end. As I mentioned as well with housekeeping, any questions that you've got, put in the Q&A box and we'll attempt to get them answered at the end. Also, just a reminder that the webinar today is being recorded and will be available later for those that registered and generally on GPSA's YouTube channel later today. So without further ado, we'll get straight into it. We'll hear first up from GPSA Chair John Gladigau, who's going to talk about the potential impacts of the pending decision on South Australian grain producers. So over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Brad, and welcome to everyone to the webinar today. It's so great to have so many people online, and this is no doubt one of the biggest and hottest topics in the grain industry today. And we as GPSA are very focused on not only being strong advocates for our grain farmers here in South Australia in regards to the future use of this chemistry, but also providing the best information available in regards to the whole AVPMA process. Brad and I were in Melbourne in July at a GPA meeting, actually, with the leaders of the other state grain organisations, when our phone started pinging with when the news of the proposals from APVMA on the review on Paraquat and Diquat came through. And since that time, there has been a very concerted and united approach behind the scenes, as all of us have sought to understand the decision, to understand the parameters on which the decision was decided, and the process for submissions leading up to the final decision by the AVPMA in February 2025. Can I first say that GPSA fully supports the need for the AVPMA to be fully independent, and we certainly in no way question that independence or the processes that they have undertaken in this review. And it's not as if this review was totally unexpected. It has actually been sitting on the desk of the AVPMA for many years. We do, however, raise some concerns around the ramifications of losing such valuable chemistry, which is certainly integral to modern environmental sustainable farming practices. Losing Paraquat Diquat or having them remain at significantly reduced rates will impact on production across Australia, and especially in our state. It will impact on our rotations, it will impact on weed resistance, economics, and the long-term environmental sustainability of our farming systems here in South Australia. And especially knowing that there are no current options available as a replacement. But some of the alternatives to having the product would take us back 30 to 40 years if it meant reverting to multiple cultivations to combat weed resistance. And while we don't want to be alarmist, no one wants to go back to a world of mass soil erosion, allowing our fragile soils to be exposed. So we've just come way too far in our sustainability journey. But we are very well aware that these impacts are not the criteria by which the AVPMA have been tasked with making the decision in this review. The criteria that the AVPMA was based around safety, it was based around MRLs, it was based around environmental impacts, including bird deaths. And we know that we can make some arguments around these, especially in regards to things like safety, where we know that most broadacre farmers are using these products in a closed loop system, so they're not having the exposure to them. And also there appears to anecdotally not be a great deal of evidence of or incidents of bird deaths or environmental impacts here under Australian conditions. So as an industry, we will be individually and collectively making submissions in regards to these criteria to the AVPMA by October, as per the process that's been outlined and by which the speakers will talk more about today. Also wanted to say that GPSA has been very proactive in providing information for the industry submissions. We did we're currently doing a very large grower survey, which asks questions around a number of things, including safety and in the way that farmers use the product in South Australia, and asking whether people use it in that closed loop system or not. We're asking questions around observations of environmental impacts that farmers are seeing on the ground, including whether they're seeing any bird deaths. These are things which can feed directly into the AVPMA's submissions. But we're also asking questions around what the impacts of losing these products and losing this chemistry would have on individual farming systems, and whether they believe they have any options if they were to either go or only be available at highly reduced rates. This grower survey is still open. It currently has over 550 responses, all of which are validated through NGRs, so they're all farmers. It's actually the biggest survey in GPSA's history, which I think just goes to highlight just how important the growers see this whole topic. All the information and other states have actually jumped on board and replicated the GPSA survey or created their own version of after the lead of GPSA's. And all the information from our survey and those of other states will be fed back into Grain Producers Australia in providing submissions back to the AVPMA by October. We'd certainly like to thank Peter Arkle and GPA for their national coordination and leadership of the information from the state farming organisations in creating a coordinated approach going forward, but also to ensure that we actually focus on the right things and focus on the areas that we can actually potentially make an impact and not just get ourselves sidetracked. The other thing I'd like to mention is that our unique South Australian-based research organisation, the SAGIT, the South Australian Grains Industry Trust, has also taken the lead in looking at how the proposed changes would impact on growers here in South Australia if it was implemented as proposed. I had a phone call with the chair of SAGIT only a couple of days ago, Andy Barr, where he informed me that the trustees of SAGIT had decided to bring forward some of their funding from next year and bring it forward now, so they can do some specific research right here and now, this cropping season, on the effectiveness of the proposed new rates for desiccation, including what spikes potentially would be effective if the 400 mil rates were actually in effect. I think this is a fantastic example of the nimble and proactive work that SAGIT does and has the capacity to do do it very quickly for growers' benefits. And certainly, while we still hold some hope that these changes won't be fully implemented, we think this is a really proactive approach from SAGIT to provide some evidence-based data going into the 2025 season, so that we actually have some real world information that if that it was in effect, what it means for growers, that they are making decisions next year if that was the world that we were operating in. So well done to SAGIT. I think Andy may well be on this call today and may wish to comment in the comment session, or may be available to speak to people afterwards. Really appreciate Peter, Sam and Gordon joining us today, and looking forward to hearing your insights on where we're going and the way forward. Certainly as a grower, what we hear everyone saying, this is my livelihood, and asking the question, so what are our industry groups doing about this? What is GPSA doing about this? All I can say is rest assured, there is a huge amount that is happening behind the scenes. We are listening to our growers. We are opening doors where there are opportunities, but we're also being really clear about following due process to ensure that we can help create the best possible outcome for growers going forward. So I think I'll leave it at that, Brett, so we can hear from some of the experts, but back to you.
Thanks, John. Appreciate that opening. What we'll do now is hand over to Peter Arkle, who's the acting CEO at Grain Producers Australia. He's going to run through process for the review, what the APVMA is able to consider in that process, and then talk about how GPA is approaching the current review from a national level. So over to you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brad and John. Great to be able to join GPSA this morning for a really important webinar at a really key time around the future of crop industries in Australia. So, guys, I thought I'd just start with a bit of an equation to help everyone get their eye in around sort of how the APVMA views the world. And this little formula, in essence, is the basis of pesticide risk management. So obviously, a fair bit is known about products like Paraquat and Diquat. They've been registered for over 50 years, and the molecules themselves are really well understood. So look, companies like Syngenta and others have a good view on the hazard side of these chemicals. But we know that risk only comes about if there's actual exposure to those hazards. And so a lot of what we'll talk about over the next 40 minutes or so is really trying to better understand the actual exposure levels we might be looking at in the real world. And from understanding that exposure, try to better understand the risks that might be on the table here and how we can argue to the APVMA around how those risks can be managed or brought within acceptable levels. So, Holly, if we just go to the next slide, I guess this speaks to the same point there, guys. Tigers are hazardous, there's no doubt. But if a tiger is behind a glass fence at the zoo, then risk is fairly low here and acceptable. But as we see on the next slide, Holly, obviously if there is exposure to that hazard, being the tiger, and that exposure is quite high, then bad things can happen and risks are unacceptable. And this is, of course, zookeeper from the Australia Zoo a few years back. So understanding this sort of hazard times exposure equals risks is really the core of what we're talking about here, guys. And this is very much a discussion around exposure and realistic exposure scenarios on Australian grain farms. So, Holly, the next slide there starts to talk about the APVMA's view of the world. And John, you've alluded to this in your introductory remarks. The APVMA really needs to assess pesticide products against 4 key criteria that come from their guiding legislation. And those criteria are around safety, the safety of pesticides to humans, both in terms of occupational exposure and residues, the safety of pesticides to the environment. The second criteria is around efficacy. Do these pesticides work? Do they do what their labels say they do? The third criteria comes down to trade. Does the registration of pesticides potentially jeopardise Australia's export markets through things like residues or MRL breaches? And finally, product labelling. Does the label on a pesticide still reflect contemporary use patterns and still provide clear guidance to manage risks to within acceptable levels? And so they're the 4 things the APVMA kind of looks at. And out of that, it's either a thumbs up or a thumbs down around whether products, or in the case of Paraquat and Diquat, specific use patterns for those products are either acceptable against the APVMA's criteria, or not acceptable, in which case uses won't be supported going forward. So if we just skip to the next slide there, Holly, we can start to see how this has played out in the preliminary review decisions for Paraquat and Diquat. And I'm quite sure a lot of people on the call this morning have looked fairly closely at some of the things that have been proposed. But what we have here are, I guess, the 6 key use patterns for grain production in southern Australia. And I guess there's three products we're talking about here. Obviously, Paraquat 360, so Gramoxone 360 Pro. The Paraquat Diquat mixed products, which I guess has traditionally been spray seed and similar products. And then those straight Diquat products, so Reglone, that we know is so important around desiccation. And this is ultimately sort of how the preliminary review decisions have played out. So in the case of the Gramoxone products, or the straight Paraquats, for fallow sprays pre-planting, those uses will be supported, but we're seeing a scenario where the maximum rate is cut by 2/3 under this proposal. And that's driven by concerns about risks to birds. If we look at Paraquat products for in-crop uses, particularly in pulses, these will be supported as well. But effectively, the old lowest rate is proposed to become the new highest rate at 285 mils per hectare. And so questions of efficacy come in, and that's really interesting news around Saget and that question. In the case of in-crop uses, it's mammal risks that are concerned there. If we move to spray seed products, or the Paraquat Diquat blends, they will be supported in full disturbance systems, but not in no-till systems. And once again, we're seeing rates cut by about 2/3, driven by. So that one's an issue around the future of no-till production, which hasn't been supported, as I've said on the line below. And then as we look to Reglone, or the straight Diquat products, supported for weed control in wheat crops at vastly reduced rate. Will be the old minimum rate. And for those desiccation uses and spray topping, it's proposed they won't be supported, once again for concerns over birds and mammals, or birds in the case of spray topping. So some fairly radical changes proposed here, guys. And look, GPA has been pretty quick into the discussion to say we're really concerned that the rates proposed here simply won't do the jobs they're meant to do in modern grain production systems. So if we move to the next slide there, we can start to sort of think about what's brought about some of these proposals. And this is a bit of a helicopter view of pesticide risk assessment and how you should approach assessing the risks of pesticides in the real world. So what's really driven this is the fact that the APVMA for bird and mammal assessments has effectively only done a tier 1 risk assessment, which looks at very conservative exposure assumptions. It looks at fairly simplistic modelling, and it relies on generic focal species, which are largely based on European studies, and uses those generic species to jump to landing points on levels of risk. So, I mean, a good example is the assumption that birds sit in a crop that's been sprayed, or a fallow that's been sprayed with paraquat, and eat all of their food for that day from that fallow area. It's a bit like this guy on the left eating all of his nutrition in a day through beer yard glasses. It's not realistic. And I guess that's a big part of what we need to get across over the next month or so. What really should happen is a higher tier risk assessment where you look more closely at the different things that a bird might eat in a day, how long a bird actually spends in the fallow area versus other parts of a farm or the wider landscape. And from that, you can refine risk assessments and all of a sudden reach a much more realistic, real-world view on actual risks here. So this is kind of the work we need to put forward over the next month in discussion with the APVMA, and I think Gordon will touch on how GRDC are really sort of leaning in on these questions. So if you move to the next slide there, Holly. These are the timelines we're talking about here, guys. So as John's mentioned, consultation is open until the 29th of October, so about 7 weeks away. And then the APVMA will then obviously take into account that feedback from the consultation, and they're proposing a final regulatory decision at the end of February next year. Okay, so what happens if they land in this place on the 28th of February next year? Well, they are saying that registrants will have 2 years to change their labels. So in essence, any changes that are in that final regulatory decision won't come into full effect until the 1st of March 2027. So that's the broad time horizons we're looking at here. Holly, if we just go to the next slide, and Brad's touched on the importance of us coming together to really get these submissions right. And it's been great to work with GRDC and GrainGrowers at a national level, sort of coordinating our thinking on exactly this question. How do we prepare a submission that has real impact in this process? So it's really important to sort of look at what the APVMA can consider in terms of things that come forward in the consultation versus things they can't consider. And really what is in scope are submissions based around scientific information around the use of these products, those exposure scenarios on grain farms, as I've touched on. And then any arguments around the methods or the approaches the APVMA have used and how appropriate or realistic they are in the context of contemporary farming. So those things can be considered. However, things that are out of scope are general feedback on commercial or financial impacts. You know, they can note them, but once again, they don't align with those criteria, so they can't consider them and use that information to change their proposed decision. So that's really important around what's in and what's out of the submissions to the APVMA. We are operating obviously in a wider environment here, and certainly information around what these products mean to your farm businesses, both in terms of agronomic information, but also sort of financial information, all help in terms of the broader discussion around the future of conservation agriculture in Australia. But as far as that submission to the APVMA goes, we need to really sort of focus in on that scientific information that allow us to make robust evidence-based arguments around those real-world risks, and then also arguments that may lead the APVMA to reflect on the approaches they've taken. So that's work that is happening, needs to be done between now and the 29th of October. GPA will be pulling together a submission guide to share with our members, including GPSA, just to help everyone sort of make the most of this consultation period opportunity to really, get these important messages across to the APVMA and to really highlight that what's proposed in these preliminary draft decisions isn't reflective of real-world scenarios on Australian grain farms, and these risks need to be looked at again. So I might leave my comments there, but looking forward to questions later in the session.
Thanks, Pete. Really good summary of the process that we're going through at the moment. Just a reminder to everyone too, if you've got a question, pop it in that Q&A box. I can see there's already 3 or 4 that have come through. So keep placing them in that Q&A box, and we will collate them and come back to them at the end of the presentations. So I'll move on to Sam Nelson from GrainGrowers, who's the Technical Policy Manager. He's going to talk about why Paraquat Diquat is so important in Australia and provide a bit of global perspective as well. So over to you, Sam.
Yes, thank you very much, Brad and John, and yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for your time this morning. So, as Brad mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the international context around what's going on around Paraquat and Diquat, and then talk a little bit about our situation in Australia. So internationally, I think it would be right to say that there's been a fair bit of pressure around Paraquat Diquat over the last few years. I mean, the chemical's been around. It was initially patented around the 60s, and it's been, in farming systems ever since then. There have been a number of concerns raised around human health and safety aspects, in its handling, and it's been predominantly those concerns that have led to bans in a number of different countries. So around 50 to 60 countries have got bans in place around the use of paraquat. I mean, they include all the 27 countries in the EU. There's China in amongst them, and a whole bunch of other countries, Taiwan. Yeah. But having said that, Paraquat Diquat is still used in countries like the US, like New Zealand, and they're used safely, and there are clear guidelines around its use and measures in place to limit access to the chemicals, to make sure users are trained, and to make sure the chemicals formulated in a way that minimises exposure and prevents people misusing the chemical. So it's sort of like not completely comparing apples with apples when we look at the international situation with the Australian situation, because there are differences in the use patterns, in the way that the chemicals are used. There's differences in the environment and the way that the chemical behaves in the environment. And there's differences in the regulatory frameworks of the different regulators and the way that they consider these risks. And so each, and the Australian regulator is making a decision and considering it on the basis of, the Australian environment, Australian conditions, and Australian use patterns. And, when we look at the use of the chemicals in Australia, we've developed practices and systems to minimise risk and avoid handling, the closed loop systems. All of these things have been developed to maximise, user safety and to minimise the chance of, of any exposure and reduce that risk, as Pete was talking about just earlier. So I think we need to very much be aware that there is pressure on these chemicals. There is a lot of scrutiny coming internationally on the use of these chemicals. But we also need to regard that Australia has good systems in place and that we have demonstrated that we've been effective stewards of the chemistry. So I think that's useful to have that context when we talk about it and where we're moving to. So when we think about the use of paraquat and diquat in Australia, as I said, chemical's been around since the 60s. It's a really useful contact herbicide, and it has a unique mode of action. And that stands the chemical apart from a number of other different chemistries in the market. Its real value is that we can use it in conjunction and rotation with other herbicides, such as glyphosate. And we use that to reduce herbicide resistance developing in weeds. That's been critical. And it's been critical to development of our minimum no-till agricultural systems. And I mean, we've seen significant changes in Australian agriculture in the last 20 to 30 years as a consequence of this, the adoption and movement to no and minimum till agricultural systems. And so, the use of paraquat, glyphosate in conjunction with glyphosate has been fundamental to some of that. I mean, Peter's just gone through the types of uses that the chemical are applied for, and I mean, it's used as both a herbicide and a desiccant. And I think it's important to look at the value that we've derived from both of those uses. I mean, as a desiccant, we've been able to adopt crops and use crops that have been difficult to incorporate into our systems previously. You know, the adoption of pulses, you know, lentils, lupins, and the way that we've been able to use the chemical as a desiccant has been you know, game changing in the adoption of those types of crops. You know, it's allowed the crops to come to maturity evenly. It's reduced losses during harvesting, and for our systems, you know, it's provided us with an alternative rotation. We've been able to diversify our businesses, diversify markets. It's improved soil fertility in the case of pulses through increased nitrogen fixation, and also provided disease breaks. You know, these are important factors in our farming systems and important, you know, components of what makes our farms profitable. But its use as a herbicide is probably you know, one of the key things and the ones that really sticks in our mind when we think about, you know, what the impact, particularly of losing the chemical might be. I mean, Paraquat Diquat, they've allowed us to develop and implement minimum and no-till farming systems over the last 20 odd years. And when we think about prior to what happened, you know, weed management was principally through cultivations, multiple cultivations over the summer and early in the season to reduce weed establishment. There was burning to, you know, minimise weed seed. And through that we broke up, you know, soil structure ends up becoming damaged. You know, you expose the soil, it reduces the amount of moisture in the soil. When we think about what we used to do compared to where we are now, we've seen a whole myriad of benefits. You know, minimum tills brought about improvements to soil structure. You know, through that there's been, you know, reduced levels of water erosion, reduced levels of wind erosion. It's allowed us to manage moisture in our fields much more effectively. We're able to accumulate moisture over summer and, you know, grow the crops, or sow the crops into soil where we don't have competition with weeds, we don't have competition for moisture, we don't have competition for fertilizer, etc. And through all of that, we've increased soil carbon, improved soil structure, improved soil fertility. And I mean, and when we talk about soil carbon, you know, nowadays you can't go past the stories around soil carbon and the importance of soil carbon in terms of managing climate change as a sink for carbon emissions. So, you know, we think about soil carbon in the field and for soil fertility, but at a national level, these things are important. So, you know, when we hear about the potential threats to this or its use in our management systems, we also have to think of some of these bigger consequences, and as industry representative organisations have to think about how do we communicate the potential impacts of these to decision makers and policy makers. And, you know, for you as growers, you've seen these changes. You've seen these changes that have occurred in your fields, you know, in the last 30 years, in the last 20 years, in less than a generation, we've seen significant changes to the agricultural landscape as a consequence of the use of these chemicals. And, you know, we recognise the value that this contributes to our sustainability in the environment, and that's obviously a real concern. The potential loss of these chemicals, you know, in our minds, it means, well, does it mean we go back to increased cultivation, increased levels of tillage? How the potential for increased, you know, herbicide resistance in weeds? This throws up a whole bunch of new and quite, you know, disturbing or concerning consequences. And so, I mean, Gordon will be talking after me around the work that GRDC is doing on responding to the APVMA's call. But I mean, GRDC has a broad strategy around some of these issues around looking at alternative chemistries and alternative practices. But, you know, effectively having to bring these forward is, you know, it does raise questions, and it is something that we'll need to think about very, very carefully. But our challenge as, representative organisations is how do we communicate? How do we communicate the benefits that we've seen to governments and decision makers, to the broader community? Peter mentioned this sort of consideration about the environmental benefits and the benefits to sustainability. Those sort of things are out of scope of the APVMA's consideration. So, it's going to be, we, as Peter said, industry representative organisations will be providing submissions to APVMA, and we'll definitely be talking about these things. But there is also a bigger story that needs to be told to the community, to decision makers around what the real implications of this are. If we're talking about national carbon accounts and so forth, then obviously we need to make sure that people are aware of what the decision here means for some of these bigger picture issues. So there's a range of different things that we obviously need to do. And I think the challenge is that how do we communicate these stories going forward? I'll leave it over to Gordon to talk about the science and the response to the APVMA's review, but there's going to be a broader strategy and some broader thinking that we're going to need to work through in terms of how do we address these challenges for the future. But yeah, thanks very much, and over to you, Brad.
Thanks, Sam, and yeah, certainly some concerning things raised there about a future without Paraquat and Diquat. We'll move on to the Manager for Chemical Regulation, Gordon Cummings at GRDC. Again, just a reminder, any questions, pop them in that Q&A box, and we'll come back to them after Gordon's presentation. I'll collate those and we'll put those to the panelists. So Gordon's going to talk about some of the research that's been undertaken in Australia on Paraquat Diquat, and just talk us through some of that. So over to you, Gordon.
Rightio, thanks very much, Brad. So Holly, if we can just go forward. Another one. Great, thanks. So look, as the guys have already done, and Pete did a great job of outlining the APVMA process and what's involved with these reconsiderations. But I guess there's just a couple of things I'd like to touch on first around that. And that is the fact that we talk about data, we talk about research. When it comes to the reconsideration process, what we currently basically have is a peer review process. A scientific paper's been published, if you like, and the community, scientific and otherwise, has the opportunity to review that publication. And that's what we're all in the middle of doing at the moment. Out of this one with Paraquat and Diquat, clearly the main issues are around environmental toxicology and environmental hazard and risk. And that really remains the domain of the registrants. Has been mentioned, these products have been in Australia for nearly 60 years. There's a huge amount of data sitting in the background which has gone into these reviews. And as I've noted there, Syngenta's provided over 1,100 publications and papers as part of this process. But that's where that knowledge resides. That's where the actual data resides. And it tends to be with those primary registrants. The Australian generic system, allowing for other companies to mirror labels and bring in cheaper product, those companies don't actually hold that data. They've never had to generate that data. They're simply copying what's already in the marketplace. So the burden falls very heavily on those primary registrants. So what is GRDC focusing on in this 90-day period of that peer review? We actually believe there's an opportunity to move the dial here on those assessments, and think back to Pete's diagram of the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 assessments levels. So basically I've done the tier 1. We're firmly convinced that we can move the dial into a tier 2 assessment, and to that effect, engaging a consultant. He's the preeminent person in this country and very highly regarded internationally, 30 plus experience in ecotox when it comes to chemistries, to look at the APVMA's assessment, to look at the assumptions being made, what parameters are being used, dietary intakes, acute and chronic endpoints, all that all that science. And that will go then become part of the response. We'll make that report available to certainly other industry bodies, key industry bodies, and that'll form part of that response to try and move the dial, basically. So at the moment, immediately in the next 50 days, that's our number one research, if you like, priority. Thanks, Holly. But if I just sort of broaden the thinking a little bit, because no matter what happens here, the landscape is going to change. We're certainly hoping it won't be as drastic as the current proposal, but there will be changes. So yeah, just a comment there that Biperidols, Diquat, Paraquat, been in this country for nearly 60 years. Okay, as Sam has so well articulated, it's become an integral part of our farming systems. The label and the use patterns and the registrations have evolved with our farming systems. So again, there's a tremendous amount of data sitting in the background there to support those use patterns. But I think probably even more importantly, there's a large amount of field experience and confidence in using these products with the current labels. We know how to get the best out of them within the use patterns as detailed by the current labels. So when we go and see changes to those labels, I think we'll see a bit of an erosion of that confidence. So the ongoing view and work and considerations would be around development, validation of the use patterns that we're left with, of the rates, of potential new mixtures, of potential new ways to maximise the efficacy and maximise the value and the benefit of the continued use of these products in the modern farming systems. So trying to look over the horizon a little bit as to what potentially industry needs would be. Thanks, Holly. So in the short term, and by the short term, I mean sort of the next maybe 6 to 12 months, maybe a bit quicker than that. But we will also be looking at collation of what the options are. Yeah, what's registered, what's under permit, but also more importantly, what's on the edge, what hasn't seen the light of day in the marketplace, which could be brought through by the registrants. Yeah, it's not going to be new compounds, but potentially new use patterns, new mixtures in support of Paraquat and Diquat with other chemistry that's currently out there. So yeah, again, it's around maybe also alternative product uses. So residual herbicides, I mean, we've seen a resurgence in their use, and there's some good handy new products there, new chemistry there. What do we need to understand more about them for them to be more efficacious in our systems, and how to use them to integrate more effectively into the new landscape? And the same sort of thoughts, I guess, around the potential for alternative post-emergent uses. Some of the Group 14 products, can they slot into that later season use patterns that have been talked about? And of course, non-chemical weed control options. And one of the obvious ones I like to see is the harvest weed seed management techniques and technologies and machinery. So whilst this conversation is heavily focused on chemistry, as GRDC as a research body, we're looking at that whole breadth of just not just chemistry. What other options are there out there? And the bottom comment, the bad news, I guess, or there's lots of bad news, but decision making is going to become more complex. So having clear understanding of the benefits and potentials and the efficacy and the effectiveness of all these different options and how to integrate that into your individual farming system, that information flow, that communication, that knowledge, getting back to that confidence, it's going to become a high communication priority for the entire industry. Thanks, Holly. So the longer term, and as I've got in the top heading there, the final landscape still is unknown. I've mentioned we're hopeful of moving the dial, which may mean slightly higher maximum rates than it's proposed, or retaining some of the use patterns which are proposed to be removed. So we really need to know that final determination before we rush out and start doing too much work, to actually know where our starting point is. But whatever that ends up looking like, it will create a vacuum in the marketplace. And what I mean by the vacuum is there is financial opportunities for new uses of chemistry and other non-chemical options for weed control. So the free market, the registrants, the companies will be looking at this. What have they got which prior to now was not financially attractive to them that they may bring into the marketplace? What extensions to labels, existing labels, have they not pursued? Again, these decisions are typically made on financial decisions, but that financial paradigm will be changing. So we will certainly, and we always do, keep in close communication with the registrants about their development pipelines. So we'll be looking to gather more detailed information there in the coming months, which will again help inform future research priorities and needs. But I do think it's quite important to recognise that really it is important the GRDC stays out of the road of the free market. If the registrant is going to do it, let them do their thing. That's what they're good at, and let them do it. And then we will look at partnering with them as needed to fill the gaps, to fill the minor uses. Classic example in my mind is desiccation of soybeans. It's a small commodity, but it's critical to that crop. But it's not very attractive to a registrant. So that's where we would consider partnering in scenarios like that to ensure that those needs are also addressed and dealt with. And potentially through the likes of the National Grower Network program that GRDC runs, addressing again some of the validation, evaluation, localized needs, developing confidence around some of these potential alternative solutions as they emerge. So thanks, Holly. Just this last little slide, I think it's nearly my last one, but who invests where? The phone is absolutely be running red hot for all of us since this point, but who invests where? And that high level of environment, human health, toxicology, as I said, that's very much the domain of the registrants, and that's largely driven by international data sets. Residues and trade, we haven't talked about that in this webinar, but that's always a key issue around the APVMA's considerations and impact on trade as a major exporting nation that we are. So that's where a lot of GRDC's focus on research sits, but also collaboratively with GTA, Grain Trade Australia, Grains Australia Limited, DAF, at that international level about acceptance of residue levels and that sort of thing. So there's a bit of that in this discussion with Paraquat and Diquat as well. But then the last one there about the data gaps around crop safety, efficacy, minor use, clearly something that GRDC has a long history in being involved in and will continue to do so. But looping that back into that previous slide about doing it in collaboration with the registrants and maximising the value and what comes out of those things. Thanks, Holly. One more. So there's a couple of motherhood statements there, which I'm ending with, but we will continue to engage with industry, the registrants, around possible alternatives and solutions. And that we also will continue to invest in a more strategic, holistic weed management view for Australian grain growers and farming systems. And part of that, if we go back to that first consultancy I mentioned, that one that we're currently doing is specifically targeted at Paraquat Diquat as part of this review. We're also looking to engage the same consultant, but at a higher level, to look at what this means in the way that the APVMA have adopted the EFSA model and its protocols for all chemicals, for all reviews, but particularly for the assessment of new products and new chemistry coming into Australia, and hoping to be able to, on a science basis, engage with the APVMA to refine the way that they look at those things, to contextualise it for Australian agriculture, to ensure that we retain a rigorous scientific-based regulatory system, but one that is clearly targeted and appropriate to Australia. So I think that's all I've got, Holly, and hand it back to you, Brad. Thank you.
Thanks for that presentation, Gordon. We'll jump straight into Q&A. We've got a number of questions that have come through, so I'll try and throw it to the appropriate panelists, and others feel free to jump in as well if you want to contribute. So just off the back of your presentation, Gordon, there's a question that's come through from Mark around GRDC also contributing to the Saget project that John Gladigau talked about. Is that something that you'd consider or have had conversations around?
Thanks, Brad. We're certainly aware of it. We've certainly had conversations with it, but at the moment we're not financially contributing. And it goes back to my comment there about understanding what the landscape's going to be, so that what work is done is more targeted and targeted at a national level and of appropriate standard and quality that it has regulatory value. So I know Andy and the team are making the assumption, and it's quite a valid assumption, that the landscape will be as proposed, and they're going to start looking at, well, what does that mean this spring, which is great. But our broader approach is to see, well, what is the final landscape, and understand what our true starting point is, and go forward from there. But we'll certainly stay in touch with Andy and the team, and it's a great springboard to start with.
Thanks, Gordon. Another question's come through from a different Mark, and this one's probably more towards Sam or Peter, but has the 2-year phase out been confirmed in writing from the APVMA? His interpretation from reading the published document is that it's not.
Yeah, look, happy to pick that up, Brad. The 2 years has been mentioned in 2 discussions that I've been directly involved in with a wide range of stakeholders. I think Sam may have been involved in probably one or both of them, but certainly we had a grains industry briefing with the APVMA a number of weeks back, obviously with the review team that had worked on Paraquat Diquat, but obviously with Sheila Logan, the head of the risk team, and also Scott Henson, the new CEO, and in that discussion with about 20 grains industry stakeholders, that the 2 years was mentioned. So yeah, we're confident they'll move forward on that understanding.
Great, thanks, Pete. And you might get a number of these questions that are sort of related to the APVMA process and some of the things that you spoke about in your presentation. Max has got a question saying, what data is being used by the APVMA to guide them on the risk to birds?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Max. You've got to the nub of the issue here, and I think Gordon mentioned the EFSA model. So EFSA is the European Food Safety Authority, which is effectively the European equivalent of the APVMA. So Europe has developed a bird and mammal risk assessment guideline, and the version the APVMA are using is the 2009 version. So as I sort of touched on, what's really happened here with the technical aspects of the preliminary decisions is that first tier of risk assessment for birds and mammals, using that EFSA model. And that does use focal species is the term, which are effectively they're hypothetical birds basically, but they're designed in a way that those birds would be protective of all other birds. But a lot of that is based on European data. So there's potentially a point there that, look, we don't have a lot of bird data involving Australian species, particularly around tox data, but a small bird that eats grain is fairly similar in Europe to what it is in Australia. So that's sort of part of the issue. But the bigger issue here is that the work hasn't been done on that higher tier risk assessment to look at actual exposure scenarios for birds in the context of no-till fallow situations. And so, as Gordon's mentioned, that's really a lot of the thinking and the work that we'll look to advance as far as we can over the next 7 weeks. And down the track, I think there'll be more work to do around different types of Australian species, particularly marsupials, which are very different to what we see in Europe. So there's work to be done there, but in the near term, it's a discussion around exposure. And I sort of looked to the New Zealand reassessment. It was only a couple of years ago, and effectively a very similar part in New Zealand. The initial draft decision was very restrictive. Industry and registrants lent in, did that second tier risk assessment, and that landed in a much more sensible place with rates at around sort of 600 grams of active per hectare, which we think could be workable. So New Zealand's a little different to Australia, but we're working hard to try and sort of improve what those labels look like through doing that higher tier risk assessment work.
Thanks, Pete. Charlie has a question. This is probably actually more of a comment based off your response by the looks of it. He said, surely if we look at environmental risks on birds, we could look at the species most likely to move into contact with paraquat and diquat in Australian conditions. Not sure about everyone else, but stubble quails, marsh, lapwings, etc. populations seem to be looking pretty good to me. That's his comment. So happy for you to add to that, Pete. Otherwise, we'll take that as is.
Yeah, look, all that kind of feedback is really helpful. We need to be careful around how the APVMA looks at anecdotal feedback, but it's interesting. There's some different work that's been done by different people. Guys like the Sporting Shooters Association have tracked quail populations for a long time. So there's some really interesting data sets that are out there that we're in the process of trying to get our hands on that help us provide a bit of robust evidence behind what a lot of people are seeing out on farms across Australia.
Thanks, Pete. I'll throw this one to you, Gordon. See how you go with this one from Oscar. What's the likelihood that as more data is generated by registrants or industry research that we could get more use patterns back later, especially for higher rates in camera sprayers?
Yeah, look, Oscar, that's a really good point, and it's something which we are talking our way through with the registrants. So I guess that's the other thing. Okay, we end up with a final determination based on what was there. Now, if there's the appetite, and I guess that's an appetite needs to be there both with the registrant and or other research bodies to look at that, to say, well, okay, that decision was made because of a lack of data by the APVMA. And an example of that is the fact that northern fallow isn't there. It's being removed basically because there was no current label claim that fitted within the new guidelines. So yeah, sit down, generate that data, put it in as a submission. It basically goes in as a new label claim submission like you would do with any other currently registered product. So depending on what the data gap is and whether it can be successfully addressed, yes, there would be scope to actually take that approach with some of these key uses. Again, once we know what we're finally faced with as what's being retained and what isn't.
Thanks, Gordon. Does anyone else have anything on the back of that question? If not, I'll move on to another Mark who's asked a question around, and this is off what you've just mentioned there, Gordon. In some places in the documentation, probably more of a comment too, in some places in the documentation, fallow is included with the aid to cultivation section as per existing label, while in the bulk of the document, fallow appears to have been excluded from the supported claims, and supported use only appears supported in association with soil disturbance at sowing.
Yeah, look, it's I guess one of the vagrancies of the way this process works. The assessment's been made. I said, right, these are the new parameters, guidelines that you work within. Now, what label claims fit within that and what don't? And basically, the only one with the current maximum AI determination is that rate combined with full cut cultivation. And I guess the funny thing is that probably goes back to the original label in the 70s when we were all running around with combines and full cut cultivation. But at the moment, that's sort of the only label claim that fits within those guidelines. But we in industry have the opportunity, as I just said, to look at that and say, well, okay, we can restructure the label, we can restructure the claim, and hopefully be able to retain some of those use patterns.
Thanks, Gordon. Might throw this one to you, Sam. So GGL and GPA, for those that don't know, have got an MOU to work together at a national level. So the question is more around how are we coordinating the message and gathering the data, and who's going to lead the charge from a national industry perspective? Sam, are you happy to answer that one? Oh, we might have lost Sam there, have we? Pete, did you want to have a go at that one then, while Sam's having a few technical difficulties?
Yeah, look, happy to, Brad. Yeah, you mentioned the MOU, so I know we do have that MOU in place with GrainGrowers. So certainly been working pretty actively with Sam and Shona and Zach and the wider team. So yeah, we've moved pretty quickly to work with GRDC to get this piece of work Gordon mentioned off the ground. So look, we'll remain constructively engaged around that, and then I think we're obviously just thinking about the best strategy around both the submissions to the APVMA, but also some of that broader political engagement that Sam touched on.
Sam, we got you?
Yeah, I'm back, and I just wanted to echo Pete's comments that GPA and GrainGrowers have been trying to work together very closely on this. And I mean, the most important thing is we don't duplicate. I mean, as everyone knows, you don't want to get hit by the same questions 3 or 4 times. And also it's better if we all bring together the information that we have and share what we have, particularly in circumstances like this. So it's been a matter of, sitting down with everyone and trying to share and work out the best strategy forward. So it's been really great.
Just a question for you, Gordon, from Justin. So it's just saying, from the presentation and general comments, it feels like GRDC are the opinion that Paraquat's already lost and have given up on helping to keep it in the chemical toolbox. Is this so?
Right, Justin, my apologies if that, and the broader audience, if that's the opinion that I gave. So very much not. I mean, yeah, we fully recognise the value of it and the need to try and retain it and defend it. I guess the point is that the landscape will change. We won't be able to defend everything in the current environment and the contemporary science that's there. And there's limitations to what you can do. So we will be, working very hard with the coalition of the willing, if I can use that term, to get the best possible outcome that we can with Paraquat and Diquat. But then also, the broader picture, looking forward, what other tools can be developed that will benefit Australian growers. But yeah, no, we're very much behind doing as much as we possibly can.
Thank you, Gordon, for clarifying that. Matthew's got a question as well. Could you clarify what validating new use patterns look like? Most farmers believe new use patterns will not work.
Sorry, Brad, was that aimed at me? And if so, I'm going to have to ask you to repeat it. Sorry.
Could you clarify what validating new use patterns looks like, as most farmers believe new use patterns will not work?
Right. So I guess what I was alluding to there was the idea of not the new proposed use patterns for paraquat, but new ideas around other chemistry, mixtures, other double knock approaches, this sort of thing, where you have sort of a two-tier of data and understanding and knowledge. There's the regulatory data, which gets us a label, which gets us the legal use of those things. But then there's the validation of that knowledge in more specific localized environments or key weeds or that sort of thing. So yeah, there's the regulatory data, which says, yes, this does work, but then it's how do I extract the maximum benefit out of that and robustness and have the confidence in my specific environment, locale. And there's a lot of farming groups do that work. Sagat does that work. Some of our NGN investments do that sort of work as well. But yeah, I was talking about not just paraquat. It's about what are the new use strategies in our farming systems.
Thanks, Gordon. This one's for you, Pete.
I might build on that last point, Brad. If in thinking about how growers that are GPSA members can sort of feed in practical information into the process, guys, and we've got a really good example now with camera sprayers in the north. I saw Matthew's question there, and obviously the label for camera sprayers assumes that 30% of the area of a paddock is treated. A few really good discussions with our New South Wales farmers and Ag Force members, and those guys are averaging kind of 5%. So even through just looking at how these products are practically used now, what going from 30% to 5% means is you've cut the amount of chemical going in the paddock by sixfold. So that's huge in a risk assessment sense. So getting good data, even from individual camera spray units, can really help us feed into this process. And it might not, we might have to do some work around permits and then getting those lowered rates onto labels over time, but it allows us to sort of improve those labels to reflect reality and take some of this conservatism out of these risk assessments. And the one in the south where I guess we'll need to make the same argument is obviously those in-crop uses for pulses and looking at actual spray timing and questions like that.
Thanks, Pete. Stay on the line there, Pete. This one's from Mick. A good question, actually. Has there been any reasoning provided by the APVMA as the move towards the change in the methodology for the hazard-based assessment rather than the risk assessment? He just said greater clarity, transparency around the reasoning would assist with review responses.
Yeah, it's a good question, Mick, and it was on our list of questions that went to the APVMA after our grain industry briefing. So I won't read what they've said in word by word, but in essence, they're putting forward the position that they've been using this EFSA model for quite a while, and so they're arguing there hasn't been a change in their approach. But as I said, yeah, I mean, what even the EFSA guidelines themselves say is that if you're running up against issues with the acceptability of uses at a tier 1 risk assessment, if that's happening, then what you should do is try and refine that risk assessment. And for birds and mammals, that basically hasn't been done in this case. So that's the work that Gordon's advancing with GRDC and, you know, the expert that has been engaged. So I think we can have confidence in what we're doing there. But yeah, the APVMA is saying they haven't changed the approach, but it really is that higher tier work that we need to do collectively over the next 7 weeks in between now and the final decision to get this back to a practical place.
And just on from that as well, Pete. Sorry, you're the man in the camera at the moment. Is there a long-term idea that we need to change the APVMA? This is a question from Oscar, review process, and that European methodology model Is it if so, is that legislative change? And if not, what other chemistry is at risk?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I sort of touched on the statutory criteria, those 4 areas: safety, trade, efficacy, labels. So the APVMA is confined to looking at those 4 very important questions and deciding whether they're satisfied or not. As I think Sam really well touched on, there's a whole bigger discussion going on here around natural capital, sustainable farming, carbon in the landscape, and the rest of government seems to be having that discussion, but the APVMA is very limited in what it can look at. And I think that disconnect is something that lawmakers should look a bit more closely at. And there's some good examples around, whether it's New Zealand or whether it's the US EPA, where they do more consciously look at that benefits case for different products or use patterns, and look at those wider benefits these products offer. And the Australian system doesn't do that at this stage. And I think it would be something we need to collectively look at going forward to really ensure the APVMA is the world-leading regulator it wants to be.
Thanks, Pete. I'll throw this one to Sam. Pete, there's a couple of questions that have come through around funding. So the question is more broadly around, has there been enough funding, or is there enough funding support to do the environmental data that's needed? As it seems, we're shifting to a process where having to prove environmental data retain old chemistry.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Yeah, this is a really challenging one. I think it goes back to some of the things that Gordon mentioned around this is a process of reassessment at the moment. So the APVMA is reassessing a chemical that is in the market. The criteria, the 4 statutory criteria that we discussed, work well for a new chemical, and the registrant can provide information and provide data around environmental safety, etc. And what we've got here is a chemical that's been in the market. I mean, there are now generic products available, and the level of information that's being requested isn't somewhat different to a new registration. And the types of questions that come out from it are, well, what species are there in paddocks? What species might be impacted? What do they look like? What are their feeding patterns, at seeding, at harvest? If we were to go to tier 3 sort of like risk assessment, or even the tier 2 risk assessment, that's the sort of level of information that we're after. And the challenge for us is that, where do you get that information from, and who pays for it? Because it's outside of GRDC scope. This is not, this is environmental data. This is really almost a pure government type investment to understand, the distribution and activity of native species in our environment. And so it's a real challenge. And this is something I don't know that we've been able to work out how to deal with. It's certainly on the top of our minds around how do we go forward into the future around it, as these sort of questions keep on coming up. But it's a gap. And there's certainly at the moment no clear place that we can point a finger at to say, you need to do this work, it's your responsibility, you need to pay for it. But I'm not sure, Pete or Gordon, whether or not you wanted to make any comments regarding that.
Sam, I guess just as a brief follow-up, you've hit it on the head. It is across all environmental issues or agricultural production systems. So one of the things that we have done for a different compound was looked at the distribution of endangered and threatened bird species across Australia, across the landscape. And that's great. You get maps with pretty blobs on them. But what are the birds actually doing within that space? Whether it's a wheat paddock, a canola paddock, a pulse paddock, a vineyard, a potato paddock, or my backyard. we need that level of granularity of what the birds are actually doing, what they're consuming, how long they're there, what their exposure risk is going to be. And that's much broader than just a single RDC. And that's what I think as you know, at a national level, we're all struggling with a bit. So we have dipped our toe in the water. But yeah, getting down to that level of detail is a huge challenge at the moment. And who foots the bill? Yeah.
So just off the back of that as well, Gordon, Mark had a question. Lots of Marks in here today asking questions around the. So we had the process with the zinc 50 bait as well, and that was also reliant on a lot of bird data. Is there any sort of proactive work that can be done on this as well as the Paraquat Diquat? Are there any similarities that could be used in between those two pieces of work?
Look, it's basically the same question and the same concern, Brad. And Mark's dead right. It is one of the roadblocks around mouse bait and the way we use it, and particularly the stronger based formulation. And I'll revert back to what I just said. That granularity of what species are doing what in what environment and what their exposure is. That's what we're trying to look at. But yeah, the resources need and how you do it is challenging.
Thanks, Gordon. Phil had a question around, and I'll throw this one open to whoever wants to answer it, but and you may not be able to provide it in detail either, but which ag chem suppliers are providing data and support? So and what's their role in all of this? Who wants to tackle that one?
Go on, Pete.
Good work, Pete.
Thanks, Gordon. Well, that's a question for individual registrants. Look, we're obviously, Syngenta invented these molecules, so they're actively engaged. They've supported these products through similar processes recently in the US and Canada, in New Zealand, and they're certainly doing the same in terms of their approach to the Australian scenario. So, look, yes, we're having discussions with a few others. Obviously, Grain Producers Australia has a long-standing relationship with New Farm, the great mental health work we're doing with Brad. So obviously talking to New Farm. But yeah, if people are aware that registrants have information that might be out there, particularly for some of these newer use patterns like the camera sprayers and so on, please do sort of feed that back through to GPSA, to GRDC, GGL and ourselves, because it'll be some of that information that's in different places already that really helps us sort of build that more comprehensive picture for our submissions.
Good stuff, Pete. This one's from Ryan, so just again throwing it out to all the panelists. Generic chemicals. So interested in the panel's views on generic chemicals and what can be done to share the financial burdens in maintaining registrations going forward. Oh, who wants to have a go at that one? Gordon?
Look, again, I guess this is where I use the term for the free market. And whilst I guess our regulatory system, which allows for generics to enter into the market so cheaply and freely, this is the backhanded sort of side of that when there is a need to retain or protect or improve, those guys just aren't there. They don't step up. So it comes back to the primary registrants. Their willingness to continue to contribute, and to a smaller degree, the ability of industry, likes of the RDCs, to partner with them to support some of those needs. But yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I meant to look it up and I haven't, but the number of generic, like there's 156 or something generic products. There's probably 18, 20 generic companies involved, or total companies involved. And most of the data and knowledge resides with one or two companies.
Maybe just a brief build on that, unless Sam, did you want to contribute, Sam, or you?
Oh no, look, Pete. I mean, yeah, it's this issue around market failure. But I think you probably have. I don't think I can add too much on Gordon's comments, but it is a classic one, and I think the challenge is, yeah, we've got registrants when they have a product that's under patent and they can protect it. Then there's they have a lot of interest in making sure that they can maintain access and protect the investment they've made. It is this issue around once we start getting older chemistries, and there's a market failure. There's a range of generics, and there's no one single champion that's willing to go there and make the investment in producing the data to ensure those chemistries stay, or that chemical stays in the market. But I think, Pete, you probably had a particular observation you're going to make, mate.
Yeah, I think you've definitely summed up the dilemma, Sam. So I was just going to say there's a bit on the table, obviously, with chemistry that's coming out of APVMA reviews over the next 12 months. And GPA has been doing a little bit of work around this that I've been helping out with. But no, I mean, if you look at them, it's the neonics, which underpin our insecticide seed treatment programs, fipronil, phenetrathion, that's our locust control backbone, Thyram for pulse seed treatments. There's a good stuff for those generic molecules that really still play key roles in Australian grain production. And this issue of market failure, it has the risk of having some really serious ramifications unless we can sort of find that model to get work that needs to be done to at least buy some time until newer alternatives can be commercially launched. But there's a lot on the table over the next 12 months.
And I think, Pete, you've just touched on this next question from Ethan, but are we going to have enough time to get evidence together before the review process ends?
We'll be able to pull together the best we can. That's for sure. We're all working really hard. And yeah, it's a question that has come up. Should we be asking for more time from the APVMA? Paraquat and Diquat were one of the 8 chemicals on the ministerial determination from Murray Watt. So there's a fair bit of pressure on the APVMA to close these reviews out. But certainly we're meeting with the Minister next week in Canberra, and we'll be having the discussion around ensuring there's sufficient time to really ensure these questions are answered properly before major changes are moved ahead on our industry. So we all need to work to that closing date for those submissions, but yeah, there's a bigger discussion that's got to be had.
Thanks, Pete. Gordon, just one from you from Matthew. So are GRDC open to supporting, so if there's outside research projects brought to GRDC as a matter of priority on this Paraquat Diquat issue, is there an opportunity for those to be considered? Obviously, there's quite a short time frame that we're working with.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what Matthew's suggesting, both project and time frame. I mean, the answer is always yes. We're always prepared to be approached. What the decision is, well, that's got to be determined about whether or not we invest in something. Does it fit our priorities? How does it fit in our investment process? All of these things. I mean, a little bit more to Pete's comment also about the last question. I mean, I like using the term that this public consultation period is basically a peer review process. We can't rip out and generate new data in 50 days. This is about collating what's known, looking at the APVMA's assumptions and processes, maybe finding material that they've missed, although I doubt that there's very much, because obviously the registrants have been actively engaged in this process for some time, and peer reviewing those outcomes and saying, okay, hang on a minute, can we Australian contextualize this? Can we refine these assumptions? So that's really what we're looking at in this very short period of time. Then there's the intermediate, the next 12 months, 3 years, while we go through some sort of a phase out of whatever the final determination looks like, and what are the needs there, and then what are the long-term strategic needs around investment in weed management, full stop. So yeah, always open as an organisation to being approached, but each approach needs to be taken on its own merit and fitted within our priorities and strategic timelines and framework to things. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Gordon. And there were a couple of points that were made in the Q&A box as well around other industries being impacted. So certainly we're talking grain here because we are GPSA. We're talking the grain industry impact, but we certainly recognise that potential reduction in paraquat, diquat use or loss will impact other agriculture industries as well. We've actually run out of time, so we're come to the end of the webinar. I just want to thank John Gladigau, Pete Arkle, Gordon Cummings, Sam Nelson for joining us, and thank you to all of those that came online, listened, asked questions. I think it was a really informative webinar for Grain Producers SA and for all of those listening. So once again, thanks for joining us.